You're listening to episode 24 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the podcast and website for modern, secular application of early Buddhist thought. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the companion website has show notes for each episode, along with resource materials on Buddhism, critical thinking, science, secularism, and skeptical thought. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Today we speak with the author, teacher, and atheist Buddhist, Stephen Batchelor. When ancient religion encounters a new culture, there can be radical change in one, the other, or both. Rarely do religion and culture simply part ways. Modern culture is no different, though we may not be any more aware of it as the fish is aware of the ocean in which it swims. As human beings, we are inextricably linked to the culture in which we live. The historical figure we commonly call the Buddha would also have been a product of his time and the society in which he lived. And happily, due to the particular nature of how his teachings were passed through the ages, we have some idea of what those early teachings were. Our ideas about those teachings, however, are changing and becoming a part of the culture in which it finds itself, ours. Some of the demands of our modern views, like personal involvement in our spiritual practice rather than dependency on a religious figurehead, and a strong desire for the validation of what we're taught, finds a particularly well-fitting partner in early Buddhism. Today we investigate that partnership and evolution as secular Buddhism finds the core teaching and practice to be pragmatic, verifiable, and as helpful today in leading a happy life as it was 2,500 years ago. Our guest is Stephen Batchelor, author of the well-known Buddhism Without Beliefs, Living with the Devil, Alone with Others, and Confession of a Buddhist Atheist. Stephen Batchelor is a contemporary Buddhist teacher and writer, best known for his secular or agnostic approach to Buddhism. Stephen considers Buddhism to be a constantly evolving culture of awakening, rather than a religious system based on immutable dogmas and beliefs. In particular, he regards the doctrines of karma and rebirth to be features of ancient Indian civilization and not intrinsic to what the Buddha taught. Buddhism has survived for the past 2,500 years because of its capacity to reinvent itself in accord with the needs of the different Asian societies with which it has creatively interacted throughout its history. Through his writings, translations, and teaching, Stephen engages in a critical exploration of Buddhism's role in the modern world, which has earned him both condemnation as a heretic and praise as a reformer. So, sit back, relax, and as Niles Crane from Frasier would say, have a double cappuccino, half-calf, non-fat milk with just enough foam to be aesthetically pleasing, but not so much that it leaves a mustache. I am here with Stephen Batchelor. Stephen, thank you so much for joining me.
It's a great pleasure, Ted. Great pleasure.
So I've already described to the listeners a bit of who you are and some of the books that you've written. And one of the things I noticed in gathering my notes for this interview is that your book, Buddhism Without Beliefs, from 1998, you dedicated to two monks, Nanamali Thera and Nanavira Thera. And you talk about them at length in Chapter 11 of your new book, out this year, Confession of a Buddhist Atheist, in Chapter 11, Clearing the Path. Can you tell us why you selected them for the dedication?
I'm not entirely sure I remember now the actual reason. But I think probably because they struck me as two key figures in my own development in understanding Buddhism, particularly in my more recent involvement in the early texts of the Pali tradition. But I think another reason is because I sort of they struck me as two sort of forebearers in a way. Both of them were English. I'm also English, so I felt a sense of a sort of kinship, I suppose. Both of them also were quite intellectual people. They were linguists, and again, that's also kind of my own temperament, I suppose. And also, what I liked in the two figures is that one of them, Nyanamoli, Osbert Moore, was one of the leading translators of his generation, produced many of the translations and others are still reading today in the middle-length sayings and so on. And that is, again, something that I feel a strong affinity with, translation. Although my translations have primarily been from Tibetan, I still feel a sense of connectedness to someone who's dedicated their life to translation. And in the case of Jnanavira Thera, or Harold Musson, he was for me a very key figure in opening my eyes to the radical nature of what the Buddha taught in the Pali Canon, and particularly having the courage to sweep away in his reading of these core texts a lot of accretions that had grown up around them in the Theravada school in which he was ordained. These were primarily the Abhidharma, the commentarial traditions, that Jnanavira felt had somehow obscured what the Buddha was actually trying to say. Now, Jnanavira, I think, is the first person, or at least the first Western writer, who, in a sense, had the courage and also the authority and the competence to make those kinds of claims and to illustrate them very vividly with examples drawn from his own study and research and writings. And at the same time, what I admired in particular in Jnanavira Thera was his very radical commitment to putting these ideas into practice. Those of you who've read the book will know that in the end he even takes his life rather than disrobe as a monk. I personally find that's going a little too far. But nonetheless, I very much admire his dedication, his commitment, and he strikes me as, in a way, one of the, I mean, if I'm really frank, I think that Jnanavira Thera, Harold Musson, I think is the most interesting Western Buddhist writer and thinker of the last century. I would go that far.
Yeah, I would agree, having read his notes on the Dhamma. It is very, he breaks the mold in his writings, very much so.
He really breaks the mold. He also, and another thing I admire about him is that he has a very refined literary style and sensibility. In other words, his letters in particular, I think, are of a high literary standard. And doesn't, unlike many people who write, Westerners who write on Buddhism, the language and the style and the tone is almost seen to be kind of superfluous. The point is just to get the ideas across. Jnanavira, again, breaks that mold. He produces literature, as well as, I think, some very high quality philosophy. So in many ways, Jnanavira and Nyanamoli are two very significant bridge makers from the early Pali tradition to the modern West. And I think I dedicated the book to them, Buddhism Without Beliefs, not because I think either of them would have endorsed what I said. That was actually beside the point. Because they stood for examples of people who dedicated their lives in the way that they did, and particularly in trying to recover and then to communicate what it was that the Buddha was really trying to do. And so I think I see myself inspired by their example, and perhaps seek in my own work to emulate what they achieved in theirs.
You wrote in your new book that you were hoping that Buddhism Without Beliefs would stimulate more public debate and inquiry among Buddhists about the issues of karma and rebirth and things like that. Mm-hmm. But that didn't happen. That instead it, as you said, revealed a fault line in the nascent Western Buddhist community between the traditionalists, for whom such doctrines are non-negotiable truths, and liberals like myself and like you, who tend to see them as contingent products of historical circumstance. What's your sense of how that ongoing situation, because we certainly do have that today, 8 years later, what do you see the sense of how that situation is going to play out over time?
Well, I'm not really in the business of looking into crystal balls. And I honestly don't know.
Past lives, future lives.
Yeah, I don't know. But what I think has become clear is that this fault line, I think, has opened up even further.
Yes.
And I get the sense that that there is a much more clear-cut distinction now between Buddhists who would consider themselves to be secular, let's say, or concerned with this world, concerned with the priority of putting a philosophical vision into practice in their daily lives as really all that really matters in the practice of the Dhamma, as opposed to those who feel that the practice of the Dhamma has no sense unless you see it as playing out over myriad lifetimes in different realms of existence. And so I think I'm not aware that anyone from a traditional Buddhist school has somehow come round to my point of view. I think I don't see any mass conversions from the Tibetan or the Theravada schools to a kind of non-rebirth and karma perspective. It almost feels, that when people get the first kind of connection to Buddhist ideas and practices, they seem to know fairly quickly where they stand in this particular spectrum, whether they are even interested in or see the point of taking on board, say, the doctrine of reincarnation, or whether it simply is a matter of such complete indifference to them that they just can't see what the fuss is about. And perhaps the one thing that Buddhism Without Beliefs has achieved, and I don't think it's alone in that, I think other books have probably done a similar thing, is that it has actually sort of pointed out something that people were not actually prepared to talk about. That I think is I feel probably the single most important thing that book might have achieved. A lot of people who write to me, they say, at least now someone is saying this.
Yes.
I've always felt like this, but every book on Buddhism I read confronts me with all this metaphysics, all of this things I find impossible to believe. And now at last someone who appears to have some sort of authority is willing to to just state in black and white what I've been feeling all along, the writer will say. And I get that again and again and again. And I found the same with my new book, Confession of Buddhist Atheist, that likewise I'm getting a lot of correspondence from people just saying, thank you for putting my own feelings into words. Now, what that shows to me is that there are out there a lot of people who are attracted to Buddhism. They probably have a Buddhist practice of some kind or another, which will usually mean some form of meditation. They're interested by certain key notions in Buddhism, like, let's say, that ideas of impermanence, of suffering, of dependent origination, of emptiness. And yet when they approach a Buddhist institution or organization, or when they pick up a lot of Buddhist books, they somehow find that their core interests are not really being put at the center of what is being taught or written about, but rather they find instead the need to embrace some rather exotic worldview that may have been fine in 13th century Tibet or 17th century Japan, but really seems to have no bearing whatsoever on the world as we know it today. So I think the Buddhism Without Beliefs has possibly stimulated an awareness that there are these two rather different cultures of Buddhism in the West that are emerging almost in parallel between what we might, as I think you would agree, call a secular approach as opposed to what we might even call simply just a religious approach. I'm not quite sure I would divide it up that way because I don't see any reason why a secular approach could not be a deeply religious relationship to life.
Yes, absolutely. A spiritual approach, right? A spiritual not in the Casper sense, but in the personal development sense.
Yeah, my concern is that if secular simply means, going on a meditation retreat once a year and being more mindful, that's really not going to do Buddhism a service. Buddhism will therefore easily become just reduced to another kind of self-help regime. And I think the real challenge that I find is that I want to articulate a secular position, but one that is firmly rooted in primary Buddhist doctrines, one that has a critical relation to the textual tradition, one that seeks to envision a complete way of life in which every aspect of one's humanity is addressed and is taken into account. And that, I think, for many people, they would almost have a kind of a religious or at least spiritual sense of that. I don't want to deprive Buddhism, I've no wish to deprive Buddhism of its complexity and its depth. But what I do think is quite an urgent task to undertake is to differentiate the extrinsic metaphysics and worldviews and cultural accretions that come along with pretty much every brand of traditional Asian-based Buddhism, and try to identify what are the core ideas that are there independently of all of the other stuff that's grown up around it. But this, of course, also means acknowledging that in the Buddha's time, too, he was not living in a cultural vacuum either, and that many of his teachings are framed in the language and the worldview of 5th century BC India, and I don't think it could ever be otherwise. And yet I feel that there too we need to recognize that even in the earliest sources we still have the same challenge to distinguish between what is original and distinctive in what the Buddha is doing at his time, as opposed to ideas that are largely accepted by people in different spiritual traditions in India at that period, and that people just basically don't question a great deal. I don't think people really had a big issue about rebirth at that time. Some, broadly speaking, if you look at the Jains or if you look at the Brahmins, it's kind of taken for granted that the practice of the Dhamma entails, working towards liberation from the cycle of birth and death. That's a kind of a norm that nobody really challenges. And the Buddha does challenge it, actually, but only in one or two fairly isolated passages. So that I see as the task that I'm committed to, is trying to make ever clearer what in fact a radically secular Dharma would look like. And that's going to take time to work that out. And of course one might run into all sorts of unforeseen obstacles along the path, but my heart is in that, and that's what I'm going to continue to be doing.
You had identified that there is a risk with having secular Buddhism really degrade into only being viewed as meditation, without the framework of the teaching. Can you tell us more about why that context is so important?
Well, because I don't think the meditation actually is meaningful unless it has a framework of values and ideas in which it is embedded. I mean, if meditation just becomes a question of stress reduction, for example, as it is called in the MBSR world, and basically the frame of reference is having stress or not having stress. But Buddhism is certainly more than just trying to find a stress-free life. In other words, just feeling more relaxed. Buddhism is about addressing the primary issues of birth, sickness, aging, and death. In other words, it is from the very outset taking an existential perspective rather than a purely psychotherapeutic one. It's actually trying to find a way of living that embraces how we think, how we view the world, let's say philosophically. It has to do with how we relate to other people ethically. It has to do with how we earn our livelihood economically. And it also has to do with how we train ourselves in terms of attention, concentration, mindfulness, the overtly spiritual elements of the practice. Now, I don't see any problem with a secular approach to Buddhism being rigorously based on the Eightfold Path, on the Four Noble Truths, which are not just about reducing stress. They are about reorienting one's principles and values that govern one's life, that render one's life meaningful, and also that gives meditation a value which is more than just feeling good in yourself or, getting nice and chilled out every now and again, but actually is an integral component of a whole way of refining and developing your life in this world with others. That would be the point I would strenuously wish to make in recognizing that a secular approach is not a dumbing down. It's not reductively identifying Buddhism with one or two particular techniques of meditation, but it is actually a complete worldview and way of life in this world.
Secular Buddhism appears to be on the rise as it encounters and integrates more and more with our modern culture. And you speak about culture a great deal in the books and this evolution of the practice. In Buddhism Without Beliefs, you said about Buddhism, it has evolved and continues to evolve distinctive forms peculiar to the conditions of the time. It has survived precisely because of its ability to respond creatively to change. And what you had just described really isn't the removal of key components of the training. It is simply putting it within our own modern cultural context.
That's correct. But of the same, by putting it in one's modern context, though, you run into some considerable obstacles where there are elements of Buddhism, traditional Buddhism, that don't fit in our modern context. So you are drawn inevitably to saying, well, okay, this may, Mount Sumeru is the center of the cosmos, and the planet Earth is actually just a green triangular shape in an ocean. I mean, most Buddhists will say, yeah, well, fair enough, yes, we don't need that anymore. Maybe that is just symbolically true, or that was how they saw the world in those days. But the trouble is, once you take that step, once you break outside that magic circle of the sort of hermetic worldview that traditional Buddhism perpetuates, you actually, in a sense, open up a Pandora's box. Because if you're going to say, well, we can do without Mount Meru, then the next question is, well, maybe we can do without reincarnation. And there you'll find Buddhists will draw a very different line in the sand. In other words, all of us, I think, who are practicing Buddhism in the modern world are going to be making certain adjustments to modernity. From the Dalai Lama on down. There might be still some people out there in remote Burma who do believe in Mount Meru and take everything completely literally. But I suspect even the more traditional Buddhists who are teaching and forming communities in the West are already, shifting the line away from a kind of literalist reading of their traditions and are making adjustments, interpretations. And so this is going on all the time. And in that sense, I feel that in a way we're all doing the same thing. Whether I'm a traditional Tibetan Buddhist or whether I'm some sort of out on the limb secularist, I think in both cases we have a common passion for the Buddhist tradition to flourish and thrive in the world as we know it. And I think the difference really is just strategic. Some people will argue that in order for Buddhism to survive, it has to preserve this, that, and the other, and others will say, no, it doesn't, it has to preserve this, that, and the other. And in that way, modernity is already changing Buddhism. And I think it's also useful to go back and look at some historical examples. A very good one, of course, is Bhimrao Ambedkar, the founder of the Dalit, or the Buddhist movement in India among the ex-untouchables. He wrote a book back in the early 50s called The Buddha and His Dharma, which is a fascinating reinterpretation of Buddhism, largely on social and political ground. It's an extraordinary text. It's not written by a Westerner. It's written by an admittedly westernized Indian. But nonetheless, it is, I think, a very good example of someone who's willing to overhaul Buddhism in a very radical way in order for it to be able to address the real suffering of, in his case, millions of people in India who are basically are vilified, are ostracized socially, and so forth and so on. And I think even movements like the Soka Gakkai is again, in many respects, a very radical departure with much of what has been known as Buddhism until the 20th century. So I don't think what I'm doing or what we're doing in the secular line, is terribly new. It's sort of inevitable, I feel.
Yes.
It would be very curious if this wasn't happening, if these questions were not being asked. What is, I think, what I find interesting is the levels of resistance that certain people have towards it. I gave a talk in Vienna a few weeks ago, and there was a lady in the audience who was literally standing up and shouting what I was saying. She found it absolutely incomprehensible that what I was saying could go under the name Buddhism. It seemed to her so shockingly disrespectful, unintelligible, that she was really very, very upset. And she was an intelligent lady, but clearly someone who had who'd identified Buddhism with a particular way of seeing the world and was really not remotely open to those assumptions being challenged.
I think that's a difficulty that many of us have in these encounters is we need to bear in mind that these people who have different views, they're not wrong and they're not stupid. They are correct within the context of who they are and their conditions, which led them to this. And that what your writings have helped do very much so, I think more than most people in our modern age, is to, as you said in a podcast interview you'd done with Vince Horn on Buddhist Geek some time ago, that you've given people permission to view Buddhism in a different way. Mm-hmm. And in some ways without abandoning their commitment to the Dharma. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think what we need to do is take a cue from the Buddha on many of the suttas on right speech where, if there's a possibility of someone's views changing, that is the time at which it's okay to engage. And sometimes they're not going to change their view, and approach them with equanimity and lay views out there.
Well, what this conversation brings to mind, is another question, namely, well, what authority do I have?
Yes.
It's all very well if you happen to be the Dalai Lama or some Thai Ajahn or some Zen master who's acknowledged in their tradition as an enlightened person. But if you're just Stephen Batchelor, who's basically a bit of a failed Buddhist, who hasn't stuck with the Tibetans or the Zen people and has got a rather quirky reading on the early tradition, what authority do I have?
Somehow I don't think the people listening to the podcast would consider you a failed Buddhist, but this is the Secular Buddhist podcast, so taken within context. Well,
it's maybe not too much of an issue for the people the rather self-selecting audience who would tune into this podcast.
Right.
It is an issue with someone who, let's say, sees the sole source of authority in Buddhism as being handed down through a lineage. Now, I live in France, and there's an organization called the UBF, the Union des Bouddhistes Français, the French Buddhist Union, or Union de Bouddhisme de France, I don't know what it exactly means. Now, the people here will not accept anybody into the French Buddhist Union unless they can demonstrate that they have an authentic lineage. In other words, I am excluded by definition. Now, one can laugh at that, but on the other hand, I do think it is a point one needs to dwell on. In other words, this question of where does authority lie? Do we place our authority in the early canonical texts, as I would tend to do? But even there, you have a problem of, well, who has the authority to decide which texts are more, let's say,
authentic,
canonical or authentic, and which texts are less authentic? Nonetheless, to give authority to texts requires a person to do that, who then assumes an authority in terms of their willingness to say this is what the text means, or this text is a later addition, or whatever. It's actually quite an important issue, I think, and it's particularly difficult when you have to relate with Tibetan Buddhists, particularly, or Japanese Zen Buddhists for whom also this lineage thing is very important. Because if we're to create any kind of sort of common ground or any sort of framework for discussion, we need to have certain things that we can agree upon. And I wonder sometimes whether I do, in a fairly deep sense, have anything much in common with a traditional Tibetan Buddhist. But that is to me an issue, is this whole question of authority.
And it's something where you want to have ready quotes from the Kalama Sutta in particular is one that's near and dear to many of us because of its encouragement to question.
That's right. Well, the problem, though, you see, is the Kalama Sutta has only really gained any notice in the Buddhist world since Westerners became interested in Buddhism. It's a very obscure text tucked away in the Anguttara Nikaya. You can quote a Theravadan Buddhist will, of course, acknowledge it, but will also probably say, but, you know, it was given in a very special occasion, da-da-da-da-da.
Yep.
Presumably being taught to the problems the Kalama people had, not to everybody. This is a common rebuttal of that emphasis on the Kalama Sutta. But then if you come to a Zen Buddhist or a Tibetan Buddhist, I mean, they won't even have heard of the Kalama Sutta, which was never translated, as far as I'm aware, either into Chinese or into Tibetan. It was probably translated into Chinese, actually. But again, East Asian Buddhists don't read the Tipitaka anyway. So you actually have a problem of the acceptability of the sources that you cite. And then, of course, you have this whole Mahayana Hinayana nonsense.
Yes.
In which the rebuttal is, well, that's a Hinayana text. It's a lesser vehicle. It's not what the Buddha was really teaching. There you have to go to the perfection of wisdom or to the Vajrayana teachings, and there you'll get the really, you know, profound Dharma. What you're calling upon, they would say to me, is of a very early, teaching for people who don't have the highest motivation.
Right, right.
That's quite explicit in the Tibetan tradition. Now, again, you've got a big problem there. I mean, how do you persuade people? Or is it even of any point trying to persuade people that this point of view does have some legitimacy? I mean, what I've tried to do in my recent book is to try to bring the historical Buddha as vividly as possible to life, so that so at least it will be very difficult for people to refute that this version of the life is probably, you know, much closer to what actually happened than the rather mythical stories that Buddhists tend to have about the Buddha. And I think in making the Buddha more of an historical person, you are in a sense secularizing him. You're actually putting him into the context of his seculum, of his time, of his age. And so I think there are two things that need to be done. First of all, to find within the Pali canonical texts those teachings that are unique, are originally and distinctively different from what was already in place at the time. And secondly, to turn the Buddha from a kind of weird God-man hybrid into a human being. In other words, as someone who is not disinterested with the fate of his family and his world, which comes through quite clearly when one reconstructs the story of the most parts of his life, and someone who is constantly engaged and involved in the issues of his day. Now, by highlighting this particular dimension of the Buddha's humanity, and by at the same time pointing to the things that are quite distinctively his own teaching, you come, I think, to a view that the Buddha is far more secular than people think. So I think there's also quite a considerable challenge in actually establishing a kind of foundation for a secular Buddhist vision or culture to take root. It has to, in order for it to do so, it has to rethink quite radically who this person, the Buddha, was, and at the same time it has to rethink quite critically what was it that the Buddha taught that really stands out, that really makes a difference to anyone's life, irrespective of whether they were born in Tibet or in Japan or in California.
You've done I think quite a magnificent job in Confession of a Buddhist Atheist in approaching the Buddha as a person who was faced with challenges of political situations that he was in and cultural issues he was in, and there were some very groundbreaking things he did, not simply in the teaching itself and some of its practices, but in, for example, the ordination of women and things like that. So he was very much a risk taker, but he had to balance that out, and you describe that quite eloquently in the book. And in your tour of the kind of the holy sites, as they're often referred to, from the Buddha's life, you describe that, the earth that we may have trod on is 8 feet beneath me. It's not right here. This is an historical framework. But the approach, what I liked about that in the book is that instead of making Buddha this unattainable, he's on a different level kind of figure, because he is put in the context of being a human being, it makes the teaching much more approachable and something that feels much more doable within one's own life.
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. That's exactly what I'm trying to do in that book. Is to bring everything down to earth, is to take all of these enlightened beings off their pedestals. I think Zen is good at that. You see, I think yes. I love early Zen materials, the Tang dynasty, Zen masters and their recorded dialogues or koans. I think this is a very similar movement to what I'm trying to do, or we're trying to do with this secular movement, is to stop and say, wait a minute, let's start again. I think in some respects Buddhism has to sort of just question itself in saying, well, what are we really about? Why Buddhism? Why should anyone be interested in this stuff? And this means really going back to the primary, questions of our existence, which again I think you find in the early Zen teachings very clearly. Early Zen is very much about sweeping clear the ground of all the kind of doctrines and scholarship and hair splitting that go on amongst academics. And it's also, I think, very much a movement to bring the practice into the reach of ordinary men and women leading ordinary lives, rather than those who are cloistered in rather well-funded monasteries. And I think we have a similar kind of move happening today. You see, that's one of the problems with a lot of traditional Buddhism is there is a kind of unstated assumption as to the ideal student who is being addressed, let's say in a discourse or a teaching. There's always this assumption that's rarely put in black and white, that the person who is a suitable vessel for the Dharma is somebody who is very much a renunciant, who's left the concerns of the world behind in order to focus on the higher values of the Dhamma, et cetera, et cetera. This is very strong, obviously, in any monastic-based tradition. But I think also there's an unspoken assumption too about the nature of the authority of the teacher. You would not challenge a Tibetan Lama in the way that lady, for example, challenged me on my talk in Vienna. There's a kind of an aura of holiness, an aura of tradition, an aura of a kind of, time-honored truths that are being relayed to us that is simply not something which any person in their right mind would challenge, would question. In other words, there's not a culture in traditional Buddhism of the lay practitioner, above all, basically saying, no, I don't accept that. Why should I accept that? I mean, who says? To do that, I think for many Asian teachers, it makes you look very sort of arrogant and disrespectful and basically a bit of a charlatan. And I'm often accused, for example, of just trying to tailor fit Buddhism to suit my practices as a secular materialist. Something like that. Now, again, that's a very easy criticism to make, and I think for many traditional Buddhists, that's the end of the story. They can see no reason why on what grounds they would have to take me seriously. But nonetheless, I mean, I do think that presents, a considerable barrier. And this is where I really feel I get quite worked up, in a sense, is the extent to which the bulk of Buddhism that is presented in the widespread, the mainstream media still perpetuates this idea of shaven-headed monks, robes, monasteries, belief in reincarnation, and it's very difficult to somehow offer a counter view to that.
Right.
One can do it on podcasts like this, but I think that's a fairly, with all respect, I think it's a fairly marginal form of.
It's limited. It's very limited. Yes.
I don't think there's thousands of people listening to this. Whereas if if a Tibetan Lama or a great Japanese Roshi came over, then they would, just by dint of their status and their titles, would have access to a much greater audience and would be able to present, for many people, what would be a compelling and an authoritative account of what Buddhism is. Now, so there's a lot to, I think, as a secular Buddhist, as let's say a non-orthodox, let's say an apostate or even a heretical Buddhist, you're always faced with having to sort of in a David and Goliath fashion resist the overwhelming authority and power and weight of tradition that is delivered by those who represent Buddhist schools that go back hundreds of years. And again, this is something that's not often talked about, but I feel it quite a lot, frankly, because I don't have the right, background, as it were, and I'm seen as a convert. It doesn't exactly, again, give one's ideas as much weight as those that, say, come out of a, even a young reincarnated Rinpoche.
Right. It seems that we have an opportunity with one of the traits of a modern view in many different religions, not just Buddhism, but others are also facing this, is that with our communication age and so on, we have more of an inclination, I think, to personalize this, to make it accessible to the individual and tease out that intervening layer of the figurehead, of the authority, and have that shifting it back, I think, to how it was in early Buddhism, to the teaching itself rather than the person interpreting it for you.
Exactly.
And we can do that now, and I think that's probably one of the reasons that early Buddhism seems to be suited quite well to our modern and I think in particular Western culture and view, is that it doesn't have as much of that authority guru-student kind of relationship, that it is a bit more of a flat model, and that Buddha specifically didn't name someone as an heir to carry on a particular lineage. He said the teachings be your guide.
Right.
What do you think are some of the qualities of this practice that give it that adaptability to the different cultures in which it finds itself?
Well, first of all, I'd like to just pick up on something you said about personalizing the teachings. I think this is a crucial point. When you go back to the early teachings, and I completely agree with you on this, I do feel that the teachings that speak to me most directly as a modern secular Westerner are those found in the Pali materials. That doesn't mean to say that I don't also find certain texts of all the traditions that speak to me, but none of them quite have the same weight as the early Pali canon. And I do think that I think not only are we in the West, as it were, looking for a practice, or many of us in the West, not everyone, but many of us are looking for a practice that somehow is more finely attuned and adapted to our own ongoing needs and questions. In other words, I wonder if we can't envision in a secular environment a Buddhism that is not tied to some sort of institution or some sort of set of orthodox dogmas and doctrines that have to be accepted at face value. That's not driven by some specialist priestly elite that makes all of the calls and to whom everybody else defers, but a practice that is far more integrated into the individual lives of particular men and women. Now you find in the early canonical texts, particularly the Samyutta Nikaya, the connected discourses of the Buddha, if you look at the sections on stream entry, you get a very good example of how what the Buddha laid out as stream entry is something rarely acknowledged today. For the Buddha, to enter the stream meant to enter the stream of the Eightfold Path. To enter the stream meant to commit one's life to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. In other words, it's a profound reorientation of one's principles and one's values into a way of life, the Eightfold Path, that then makes you part of the Sangha for whom others would go for refuge. The bar is way, 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 way lower than nowadays. If you, in Theravada Buddhism, to be a stream entrant is now sometimes considered to be an almost, impossibly rarefied point of spiritual accomplishment and attainment that some monks might achieve if they're lucky. Whereas that seems to have departed quite significantly from what the Buddha laid out in the very text that these people honor. And so stream entries become defined primarily in terms of some sort of private experience in which certain fetters have fallen away. Now the Buddha does speak of it in those terms, but quite rarely. His main emphasis is not on the negation of certain fetters, but rather on the entrance into a way of life focused around certain core values. And one of the other defining characteristics of a stream entrant is someone who has become independent of others in the Buddha's teaching. Independent of others in the Buddha's teaching. Now that to me is a very, very important point. In other words, once one embarks on this way of life and you, in a genuine and in an authentic way, when it really takes a center place in the narrative of your own life, then you become more and more your own authority. You become independent of others in the Buddha's teaching. And in that sense, I think the Buddha himself was already pointing to the fact that monks, nuns, lay women, lay men all had equal possibility of becoming their own authorities, and thereby, in a way, diminishing projecting authority or onto some external figure or some external institution. Now, I find it very strange, frankly, that although the word guru and chela were in use at the Buddha's time, you find them, it's the basic model of the Upanishads. The Upanishad literally means one who sits close to you and hears the whispered instruction. That was something that you needed to receive from a guru, an enlightened master, and you needed to surrender your authority to that figure. Now the Buddha, when he's rejecting not having a successor, when he's saying that I am not a closed-fisted teacher, I do not hold special doctrines back for some elite, when he encourages his students to be islands to themselves,
yes.
to be autonomous, he's rejecting that whole model of the Guru Chela. And I find it rather strange that model came back with a vengeance, particularly as we find it today in some of the Mahayana schools, where the whole practice, in Tibetan Buddhism, the practice is simply not possible. It's something you'll never achieve the goals of the Buddhist path unless you are able to surrender your authority to that of an enlightened lama, which means guru. Here you have, I think, a good example of something that has become very central for many Buddhists, was in fact something the Buddha himself clearly rejected. Now, I think that is a point, and there are many others, in which I wish there were more open debate about this. This is where I feel slightly frustrated in terms of your first question about a wider debate after the publication of Buddhism Without Beliefs about rebirth never took off. I think there are equally important debates about the nature of scriptural authority, and particularly the status of the guru. Buddhism has become, for many practitioners in the West today, unquestioningly a matter of guru devotion. And that, I think, betrays what the Buddha was about, frankly.
Yeah, and it makes it challenging when you take enlightenment or even stream entry as such a lofty goal to be attained, because functionally that's what it has become for many lineages, instead of a practice one does on a daily basis. And that makes it unattainable, and I think negative effect of that is that people then don't take on the practice, because it is something that they say, well, I'm not going to make it in my lifetime. It's not going to happen. And so you have both rebirth and the idea of enlightenment being a mystical experience, disincenting people from really genuinely taking on the practice in their daily life in this lifetime.
That's absolutely right. And these attainments become endlessly deferred off into the future.
Right.
And it's quite surprising. It's not surprising. I mean, it is the case that this is what you will be taught in some of these schools, in the Theravada school too. That if you're a lay person with a job, with a family, the idea that you can make any kind of significant progress along the path is
not so likely.
Very unlikely. Although of course there are some exceptions. You've really got to sort of work for a better rebirth. Now, to me, that is completely unacceptable. I think the best critic of this particular point in religion, because clearly Buddhism isn't alone in suffering these problems, is Ludwig Feuerbach, who was the Hegelian philosopher who, in a sense, gave Karl Marx his key ideas about religion. It was Feuerbach, in fact, who coined the expression, religion is the opium of the people. Now, Feuerbach's argument in his book, The Essence of Christianity, is basically to show that religious institutions are effectively systems of alienation. In other words, that the more powerful the religious institution becomes, the more elevated become its values and its goals, and the more distant becomes the experience of the ordinary person on the street from the lofty attainments and insights of the priests or whoever it is that controls the religious institution. The religious institution then allies itself with certain forms of secular power and becomes the sort of moral wing of the state. And all of this serves, both politically and spiritually, to disempower and to eventually alienate the ordinary person from the realization of their genuine human potentials. And I think Buddhism has been complicit in this kind of alienating function of religion as much as any other, frankly. And I think it's time that we really do launch a thoroughgoing critique of this whole movement within Buddhism and bring it back to earth, bring it back not only to our own experience here and now and what is actually realizable in our lifetimes, but also bringing the Dharma back to as clear an understanding as we possibly can of what the historical figure Siddhartha Gautama was doing.
I am going to read as a quote that I have from Buddhism Without Beliefs. It's directly what we're talking about now. He said that the democratic and agnostic imperatives of the secular world demand not another Buddhist church, but an individuated community. I love that phrase, individuated community, where creative imagination and social engagement are valued as highly as philosophic reflection and meditative attainment. No longer will it see the role of Buddhism as providing pseudoscientific authority on subjects such as cosmology, biology, and consciousness as it did in pre-scientific Asian cultures. Rather, the pessimistic Indian doctrine of temporal degeneration, it will emphasize the freedom and responsibility to create a more awakened and compassionate society on this earth. I think it was a beautiful turn of phrase for what you're describing, and I think one of the challenges that we also face in this, and you had also alluded to in your books, is that many people have come to Buddhism through a rejection of another tradition. Mm-hmm. And that the things that they rejected about that tradition weren't so much the teachings themselves, they were just the dogmatic expression of them. And they themselves have become very dogmatic in their expression of equally unprovable points of view.
Yeah, it's interesting hearing you read that passage from the book, which, I mean, I don't read my books, so it's kind of...
You should, they're very good.
Well, the strange thing is when I do see them quoted or read back, I actually sometimes find it hard to imagine that I was the person who wrote them. What experience. Yeah, that's right. It's, I mean, to me, and I suspect to you too, I mean, all of this seems blindingly obvious. And I suspect a lot of the people who are listening probably do not just would find it hard to know why anyone would dispute this kind of picture.
Right.
But in a sense, we're perhaps therefore just singing to the choir, preaching to the choir, as they say in Christianity.
Yes.
And again, going back to the point I raised earlier on, is that is it important that we actually widen our audience? Are we in the business of having to persuade others that we are right? Or is it more important just to get on with realizing those things that we, in a very heartfelt way, believe to be the essential and the crucial, practices to be undertaken? I suspect the latter is actually more important than getting involved in, lots of kind of discussion and debate. Particularly, I think that, I don't think I have much chance of persuading a committed Tibetan Buddhist of my point of view. They would have to first of all become disillusioned on their own grounds, and then this does in fact happen. I get a lot of ex-Buddhists of different schools coming on my retreats or writing me emails because they've rejected perhaps or haven't been able to swallow a particular orthodox viewpoint, but at the same time, they still retain a strong commitment and love of the Dharma. And they're looking for a way to somehow continue with that without having to buy into things they find unacceptable. So, I do think it's important, and we touched on this in our earlier conversation, that we move towards creating some sorts of virtual communities, some kind of structures that enable people who have this perspective on their practice to be able to feel that they're part of a community rather than isolated individuals. Now, I get this a lot. I mean, people write to me from all sorts of odd places, and they don't feel any relation with any of their local Buddhist groups. They don't find anyone in their local community who's interested in the sort of way of looking at Buddhism that they found helpful. People feel very isolated. And I get a lot of people writing to me saying, where can I go to find a center that practices Buddhism as you describe in your books? And there I fail people, I'm afraid. I don't have any kind of organization or institution either set up by myself or anyone else. And I'm personally not either very good at or very interested in pursuing that kind of work. But I do think it's, at some point, we need to create a fora, and in a way, the secular Buddhist podcast and website and so on is, it's a good example of at least a beginning in this field. And as I mentioned in the end of the Buddhism Without Beliefs book, I do offer a kind of perhaps rather idealistic vision of what Buddhism might come to look like if we were to put these principles into practice. And I think that's what it would be like. It would be supporting smallish communities of like mind, people drawn together by a common passion for a particular practice or a particular philosophy, who are quite comfortable working independently of any kind of heavy institution or authority figures. But we do need to create, I think, some sorts of frameworks within which these kind of practices and this approach can be more fully developed and actually become more visible. And at the moment, secular Buddhism is a term that's floating around, but there's really very little of anything concrete that you can point to and say, well, here's somewhere you could go to and develop these ideas or find people of like mind. And I do think we need to do that. And I hope that is slowly beginning to emerge. I suspect it is because I'm fully aware that there are many people out there. And also I'm aware that there's many people who are put off Buddhism and yet would actually probably benefit from it if it could shed some of the things that are off-putting.
Precisely, and that's part of what has happened a great deal in even just with the podcast is that people write and say, thank you for putting this out there, and it's looking at the website, for example, a lot of the resource materials that are available I've already read most of those. This is great. I thought I was the only one. And
that's right.
There's not an awareness that there are many of us who have a practice where we may not resonate as well with a particular, the local center of whichever tradition because of that. And making this more available, I think is going to be one of the, not in a conversion, hey, do this, but in a, here's something that can show you that you're not alone. There is actually a vibrant and energetic practice that takes on these kinds of views that we have in our particular cultural context.
No, absolutely. I mean, what I kind of envision is something like a sort of a secular Buddhist network in which people can somehow connect to, whether it's web-based or whether at some point it actually has some sort of physical location. But I think, yes, I do think this is important. I think to make people aware that there is another way of going about Buddhism, and not just in the abstract, but offers actually some sort of concrete, context for doing this. And there's maybe some sort of internet forum, or maybe occasionally holding, sponsoring retreats of a explicitly secular Buddhist nature. Secular Buddhist retreats, secular Buddhist conferences, secular Buddhist study groups, all of this stuff could be set up. The trouble is, though, I think to, first of all, define ourselves more clearly. One can throw the word secular up and people can identify with it, but for it to be the basis for something more rigorous and long-term, there does need to be, I think, a rather conscious attempt to say exactly what we mean by secular. For example, secular doesn't mean just not religious. That may be the sort of common understanding people would have of it, and that's how the media use the term. They say, for a secular approach to this question, which usually means an approach not informed by any religious tradition. Whereas I would understand secular not in that negative sense, i.e. not religious, but rather in the more positive sense of secular meaning this age, this seculum, this world, that a secular Dharma is one that is entirely committed to the practice of Buddhism in this world alone, without any kind of escape clauses or ifs or buts. And in that sense, you see, I've moved beyond the agnosticism of Buddhism without beliefs. I think agnosticism is a very important aspect of a secular approach, but to just have an open mind can also be very fuzzy. In other words, people can still sort of hold on to the possibility that, well, maybe there is another life, maybe it is all true after all. And that, I think, can somehow weaken one's commitment to addressing the suffering that is present in this world here and now, in my own life, in the life of my community, and I think nowadays, inevitably, in the actual well-being of the whole biosphere. And that, I think, is what the secular approach has to be more affirmative and positive in terms of where its practices are located and what its concerns are, rather than just defining itself negatively as not being a religious approach.
That's the challenge that I've always felt, that two of the movements that are near and dear to my heart as well is atheism, which to me is challenged by being at its at least how people view it, a negative proposition. There isn't as much of a positive proposition, and I know many atheist communities are trying to turn that around, and they've acknowledged, yes, that's true, and we need to not just be about chipping away at religion, we need to have a more positive view. And the other being secular humanism, which has that, a more positive view and ethical framework, but where, to me, has fallen a bit short, and why secular Buddhism has been more inspiring to me has been that secular humanism doesn't have a systemized practice. It's one thing to tell people, here's how we should be, which I think secular humanism does a very good job at, but it's quite another for people to be able to put that into practice. And Buddhism offers that framework and that way of doing it moment by moment.
Yeah, no, I agree with you completely. I mean, this I think is the great strength of Buddhism. Is that it offers us a set of things to do, and not things just to do blindly, but things to do in order to test them. Does it? In other words, there's a strong pragmatic element within Buddhism that is more concerned with the effectiveness of a particular discipline or practice or idea, and effectiveness in actually making a qualitative difference in your life, rather than proclaiming something because it is true, that it somehow corresponds to some state of affairs in reality somewhere. And this I feel this has been, I think, a consistent thrust you find right through the Buddhist early tradition, particularly the metaphor of the arrow, the metaphor of the raft. Many of the Buddhist teachings are clearly about doing something that actually makes a difference in your life. And of course, the Buddha lays out a very a clear, I think, set of exercises, practices, ideas that you can actually put into practice and actually realize the benefits of them by doing it yourself. And this, I think, is possibly what distinguishes Buddhism from, certainly from secular humanism, of which there really is no practice at all, as far as I can make out, at least in that sense. And of course, also equally with atheism. I mean, how do you practice atheism? It's, but I think this is also true for Buddhism at large. I mean, I think all of the schools of Buddhism, even the most traditional ones, will also, I think, attract people precisely because they too will be saying, this is something you can practice, and over many lifetimes it might take, but nonetheless, it's something you do. And that, I feel, is very much, must be at the very heart of what we might try to define as a secular Buddhist approach.
Right, that there are other traditions and for example, atheism and secular humanism that have ideological stances, but not methodologies.
Yes, I think that is definitely the case. I'm actually looking at the moment. I was interviewed by the Secular Humanist magazine of Scotland, and they give a list of what is secular humanism, and they say humanism is ethical. 1. Humanism is rational. 2. Humanism supports democracy and human rights. 3. Humanism insists that personal liberty must be combined with social responsibility. 4. Humanism responds to the widespread demand for an alternative to dogmatic religion. Very good. 5.
That's the what. What about the how?
Well, that's the problem. And all of these seven sort of theses that they publish effectively just affirm certain values, but with no real suggestion whatsoever as how they might actually be realized. And that, I think, is what would have to distinguish a Buddhist approach, is that one would be based very, very clearly on a form of praxis. But again, we have to be careful. By practice, I don't mean becoming good at doing the jhanas or becoming
right.
the breath for an hour at a time.
It's not just meditation.
It's not just meditation. And this, again, is a very good example of this, is the word bhavana. that is nowadays used in most Buddhist schools just to mean meditation, or sometimes it'll be translated as mental development. But it fails to acknowledge that the Buddha recognized the whole of the Eightfold Path. Each of those branches has to be practiced, has to be bhavanat.
Yes.
Bhavanat
Yes.
is the word he uses for right speech, thought, action, everything. And so we have to extend the idea of practice away from this rather narrow and reductive idea that it's all about becoming proficient in certain spiritual exercises, which is important. Again, we don't want to dismiss that. But to recognize that one's practice, in fact, is one's whole life. That the way you think, the way you speak, the way you work, this is your practice. And that, I think, is something that Buddhism has, in all schools, has rather lost sight of. That practice is almost exclusively understood as inner, private exercises done by yourself on a cushion, on retreat, something that's kind of invisible. And there's a very good example of this. I don't know whether you know the second discourse in the Digha Nikaya called the Samanapala Sutta, the discourse on the homeless life and its fruits. And the Buddha is actually questioned by the king Ajatasattu, who says, can you point to anything in your homeless life that actually has benefits here and now? Now, I look at my cooks, I look at my elephant handlers, they do their work well, and they can be seen to be benefiting from that. And then the Buddha says, well, imagine you had a slave, and the slave said, well, wait a minute, I'm a man, the king is a man. What if I were to go off into the forest and shave my head and put on a yellow robe? Would you then, king, expect that man to be, called back into your service? And the king says, no, I'd respect what that man had done, the former slave. And then the Buddha says, well, there you see a result here and now of the homeless life. Now, what's interesting about that passage, not only does it's one of the few passages, or only passage, that addresses the issue of slavery, but also it shows that the Buddhas saw what he was presenting as something that did have a concrete effect in this world here and now, not just in an explicitly spiritual sense, but actually in a sense of social improvement, social well-being, a change of one's status from a slave to a free person. In other words, it has social as well as psychological consequences. And of course the engaged Buddhist movement, I think, has been pointing this out rather well, I think, for some years now. But the problem with engaged Buddhism, I find, is it puts too much of its emphasis on the, social justice or so forth, which I do think are very important. But again, what I'd like to feel was that if we take this word secular and try and envision a secular Buddhism, it would be one that would give equal emphasis to all of these different areas of our lives, but focused entirely upon the differences that would be made, not only to us subjectively as sentient beings, but also in terms of the kind of community, the kind of society, perhaps even the kind of politics, the kind of economic situation that we may have. And that to me would be a recovery of what I feel was the Buddha's genius in a way, was to really picture a set of values and practices that together could actually be a civilizing force in the world. And that, I think, is what a secular Buddhist movement should never lose sight of. Instead of just sort of tinkering with some details and saying, well, you can do your meditation, but you don't have to believe in rebirth. That is not, for me, adequate as a definition of a secular approach. Secular Buddhism, when you take it seriously, actually begins to challenge pretty much every area in which Buddhism has been saying things over the last 2,500 years. And really, I think, does call for a new beginning, starting all over again, in a sense, starting from scratch.
I think that's an excellent place for us to close. We did successfully dodge discussing rebirth and karma. Congratulations.
Yes, I'm very pleased that we didn't get onto that.
This time. We'll have to do it another time. Sorry, you don't get off that easy.
At some point, I need to write more about it as well, to really just sort of state far more explicitly where I am on this particular point, just to get it out of the way and in print.
It is a very challenging topic that we'll address another time. Is there anything you wanted to say to kind of wrap up our discussion today?
No, I think we've covered a great deal of stuff. We're clearly on exactly the same wavelength, and I'm really glad in what you're doing. I think it's a great offering, and I just hope that those of you who are listening to this can also maybe activate yourselves to really try to bring into being some community, some network, through supporting sites like the Secular Buddhist, and maybe just galvanizing your friends and anyone you know who thinks in this way to sort of get together more, communicate more, try to make this idea into something that is, a live community of some kind, rather than just a good idea.
Yeah, precisely. Stephen, thank you so much for being here. I've enjoyed our conversation. Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the companion website at www.thesecularbuddhist.com, and you'll find an entire web page devoted to this and every episode. There are also links to discussions about today's topic on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. The music for the Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the Secular Buddhist on the About Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.